When is it fair and equitable to evict an elderly person from their lifelong home? When can a property owner claim the right to a property? Hi, I'm Simon Dippenaar and I'm an attorney. These questions have vexed a number of courts in the land, finally being settled last week at the Constitutional Court. It's an interesting case because it demonstrates the robustness of our rental housing legislation and our Constitution to protect the interests and rights of both owners and occupiers. The fact that this case underwent several appeals shows just how complex occupancy disputes can be and the extent to which our legislation seeks to protect vulnerable people. This case has had extensive media coverage, so it's not inappropriate for me to refer to parties involved by name. William Grobler purchased a residential property in Somerset West near his home, with the intention of housing his elderly parents. The house was occupied by Clara Phillips, an 84-year-old widow who lives in the house with a disabled son. She's lived there since 1947, claiming a right to lifelong occupancy granted by the previous owner. The right of occupation was declared invalid and unenforceable by the Magistrates Court as it was not registered against the title deed. The court granted an eviction order against Phillips. She appealed the order of the Western Cape High Court, citing not only the Prevention of Illegal Eviction and Unlawful Occupation of Lands Act, or PI, as usually is called, but also the Extension of Security of Tenure Act, ESTA. PI in particular contains specific provisions protecting vulnerable individuals, including women and the elderly and people with disabilities. The Phillips household ticked all the boxes and the High Court upheld the appeal, saying that the eviction order was not just and equitable due to her advanced age, the length of time she had resided in the property, and the fact that her household included a disabled person. However, Grobler was not a ruthless, uncaring property owner. He acknowledged Phillips's circumstances and repeatedly offered to purchase alternative accommodation for her within the community. He appealed the overturned eviction order to the Supreme Court of Appeal. This court dismissed the appeal, despite the occupation by Phillips being unlawful. The court said that there was no misapplication or misdirection of the law or any misdirection on the facts. Held that the situation in which the full exercise of ownership had to give way to the right of vulnerable persons to a home. Grobler wasn't willing to forego his attempt to house his own elderly parents near his family and appealed the case to the Constitutional Court. He argued that the SCA had overlooked the fact that Phillips would not have been rendered homeless as alternative accommodation had been offered to her. The Constitutional Court held that its engagement with the case was legitimate because eviction from one's home is a constitutional issue. Justice Svicki said that an unlawful occupier such as Phillips does not have the right to refuse to be evicted just because she wishes to remain on the property she unlawfully occupies. The judge said the Constitution does not give Mrs. Phillips the right to choose exactly where in Somerset West she wants to live. The court considered the interest of both parties and determined that it was just and equitable to grant the eviction order, which would not in these circumstances render Phillips homeless. Phillips would only be required to relocate from one home to another in the same immediate community within Somerset West. I find this case interesting and encouraging because of the extensive consideration given to both parties' rights and interests. The various courts in all their judgments applied the legislation as they saw fit. The law is not black and white, and the role of any court is to interpret legislation in a just and equitable manner in the context of the case before it. A constitution protects vulnerable members of society and it safeguards the rights of legitimate property owners. Ultimately, the Concourt's decision ensured both mandates were upheld.